next couple NHL drafts, we have some absolute superstars coming up, like Gavin, McKenna, and Landon Dupont. Top tier NHL prospects that will almost single-handedly make NHL teams rebuild. And today I wanted to go through all 32 NHL teams to see which ones are the closest to rebuilding, the farthest, and which ones are the most likely to commit to that full rebuild over the next couple of seasons. So make sure you watch till the end as we go through the entire tier list here today, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year. But ladies and gentlemen, let's get started here with the tier list right off the gate. I have 5 different tiers here to rank all 32 NHL teams. Starting out in the already rebuilding tier, this is for the teams like the Chicago Blackhawks, spoilers, that are already in the middle of the rebuild and already, of course, have committed to it. So not really much to talk about there. But then you keep going with the teams that have finished their rebuild and are looking to take that next step in the playoff race. Then you have the teams that are contenders both now and the future. Really the teams that I have seeing solidified cores that aren't going to be rebuilding anytime soon. And then you have the first 2 tiers right at the very top. The need one soon tier, where it's a team that maybe is on the end of their leash, maybe in a couple seasons time when the players are a lot older or retired potentially. That's when they're going to start looking at it. And then I have the full rebuild now tier. Teams that I just don't see going anywhere unless they commit to a full-scale rebuild, and this one's going to get pretty harsh. Now, it's an interesting point to start out here because we have the Carolina Hurricanes as the first team, and they're going to be the first team in the contenders now and in the future. Now, this is a credit to them, I would say, because their prospect and drafting situation has been so critical to this Canes' success over the years, and especially this season when you've had players like Jackson Blake coming in a pretty major role, but you have a lot of players in the prospect pool who will be major contributors. Players like Scott Morrow, for example. You're going to have a big-time one in Alexander Nikishin as well coming in, so you got a lot in really every single position, maybe besides center, but besides that, I think every single position is filled pretty well in the future, and I think for the Canes, they're pretty young, but still in a good contending spot, a perfect balance. Now we're going to the Montreal Canadiens, and a year ago, they probably would have been in the already rebuilding tier, but I think they've really proved themselves this season and finish up in the finished rebuilding tier, and maybe they could use maybe another top 15 pick, perhaps, but I don't think they're in a situation where they need to draft any more absolutely top tier players. You got your Demidov, you got your Lane Hudson, those 2 guys are going to be terrific, on top of the great young core already of Suzuki, Slavkovsky, Caulfield, players like Struble as well into the defense. David Reinbacher is going to be huge. The goaltending of Jacob Fowler, Volokin, even Dobesh has looked pretty solid at points this year. Montreal really has so much going for them in every single position. I didn't even mention Michael Hage as well, freshman of the year in the Big Ten and the NCAA. Montreal has a great future, and now they're finally starting to take those next steps, which is awesome to see. Now on to the Chicago Blackhawks, and they're going to be the first team here inside the already rebuilding section, and this makes sense. Chicago, especially this year, has proved that they are still a long way away from finishing the rebuild, but they're right in the thick of it, have been committed for a pretty long while now, but we'll still have to wait quite a bit longer for them to actually see the finish line. Now we're going to get into a little bit of a juicy one here, because next up we have the Nashville Predators. They're going to be the first team for me to be in the full rebuild now tier. Now they've been a strange one because they've been mostly a playoff contender before this season, being a team that's been up and down, but mostly inside the playoff position. This year, though, I think has just shown how many problems are within that Nashville roster, and also how they exacerbated some of their problems too. They were already pretty old, I would say, and then this offseason they went out and doubled down on it. So they looked so much more slow and so much less competent this year, and even though the names are there, players like Stamkos are fun to have, they just didn't really produce much in the way of actual wins this season. And I think for Nashville, especially how that prospect pool is looking, where it has some decent names, but it's nothing overly special, I think they really need to see their future and really see it as a rebuilding one, because they have a big opportunity here to still build within a player like UC Saros, but I think the time to build with players like Yossi, Stamkos, Ryan O'Reilly, that time is over. Nashville probably won't go in the full rebuilding scale direction, but I think they honestly should. Getting a top pick in this year's draft will be critical, but I think these next couple of drafts too, if you can get one of a McKenna or Dupont, that completely changes your franchise, on top of who they'll likely get in the top 5 this year. Next up, we go to the Columbus Blue Jackets, and they, like Montreal, are going to find themselves in the finished rebuilding tier, but they've been a team that has also made a pretty big jump this year, really regaining confidence this season. A lot of that is because of the young core that's really stepped up. You, of course, have the unbelievable season that Zach Werenski is having, but on the younger side, players like Kirill Marchenko, the continued dominance of him, Adam Fantilli's taking a step, Kent Johnson has been a terrific finisher this year. I would say the big thing for me is that they could still use a little bit of juice, maybe defensively in the prospect pool, but they still have a lot of really interesting young pieces there. And on the goaltending side, maybe that's something they look to trade for, maybe a younger goaltender, but they have goaltending prospects in Evan Gardner and Sergei Ivanov, who I think could be solid there. So we'll have to wait and see, but I think for Columbus, at least right now, they've proved themselves to get up above that Chicago side of things. Now on to the Anaheim Ducks, and they're a team, unfortunately, not like Montreal and Columbus, that has been able to prove themselves yet, but maybe next year is the year for that. They have been a little bit better in some key categories, and the goaltending especially has been a category that's really helped them this year. Lucas Dostal is looking like one of the best young goaltenders in the future, but outside of that, they still have a ton of great young pieces. Jackson Lacombe has been amazing this year, taking big steps, but you also got Pavel Mentyukov, Olin Zellweger, Tristan Luneau coming up, and on the forward group, you have a lot of interesting pieces. Leo Carlson's been playing a lot better as of late, Cutter Gauthier, Mason McTavish. You have a lot to work with there, and Trevor Zegras as well getting healthy is pretty huge for them. They're not quite pushing ahead, but I think now you're starting to see the light in the tunnel with this rebuild and starting to see eventually why it'll get better, but unfortunately not quite yet. That progression has come. We'll see though. I'm still hoping there's a different coach next year, but a man can dream. Now on to San Jose, and they're also pretty firmly in the already rebuilding tier. Now, the future looks fantastic with how good Celebrini has been, and just how good that lineup could look like with William Eklund, Will Smith, and what they could get in this year's draft as well, on top of players like Igor Chernyshov and Quentin Musty. Defensively, got Sam Dickinson, Luka Cagnoni, and potentially Matthew Schaefer from this year's draft. And on the goaltending side, Yaroslav Askarov is such a good goaltending bet to have in the future. They're looking to have really critical pieces in all positions, and even though I would still see San Jose as a little bit more further out, they have the pieces in place on top of what they'll probably get in this year's draft, and they'll probably still be in a similar position next year. And if they get a Gavin McKenna, man, oh my goodness. Now we go into the Buffalo Sabres here, and this is a weird one, man, because they shouldn't still be in the already rebuilding tier, but I have to put them in this position. I mean, there's no other way to put it. They've tried to get out of this position for years and years and years now, but it's the Buffalo Sabres, and they'll probably be in a similar position next year. Let's be real. Now we go into the Colorado Avalanche, and they're going firmly in the contenders now and in the future tier. Now I would say they have a little bit less of a future than Carolina, just because the prospect pool I think is a pretty major difference. They don't have a lot of key young guys coming up and filling major roles like the Canes do, but Colorado still has McKinnon, they still have Makar, they still have a bunch of these guys like Lehkonen and Nichushkin still in the prime of their careers, and that's still going to allow them to be a contender, especially with the trades they made this year with players like Mackenzie Blackwood being added on. That to me I think is really going to help the longevity of the team as well in the goaltending department. They're going to be just fine, though I think with the prospect pool difference, they may be closer to a rebuild than Carolina, but also, again, still McKinnon and Makar, that's a long ways away. Now on to the Calgary Flames, and they're kind of a unique case, I would say, because they're not really a rebuilding team. They're not really one that was really ever rebuilding, but they're a team that has, of course, proved their competence this season, just like Columbus, just like Montreal. They might not make the playoffs, but they've certainly proved that they can stick with those teams and still be in the race no matter the situation. But they're an interesting one. They're a team that's kind of gone in both directions, rebuilding on the fly while also still trying to compete. And with the players like Dustin Wolf coming in, Matt Coronado, a lot of the young depth there already, they've been looking pretty solid. And that prospect pool has some pretty great names as well coming up, like Zane Parekh especially, who will be huge for that defense. I think for Calgary, they're in the middle right there, but I think even though I would want to see them rebuild a little bit more than they have, I get why they want to do this. You don't want to be a team like Buffalo who's in the dumpster forever, and Calgary will have to wait and see if they do it right, but the names coming up in the prospect pool has some really underrated names there. Now on to New Jersey, and they're a team that goes straight as well in the contenders now and the future tier. I would say their prospect pool has kind of graduated quite a bit and has left a lack of depth, I would say, but the Devils have a good problem to have where so many of the younger prospects have turned into quality NHLers, and they don't quite have to worry about that anymore. You have, of course, so many young pieces there like Jack Hughes and Luke Hughes. You have players like Nico Hischier who have really developed into their own. I think for New Jersey, they're going to be an interesting one, though, in the goaltending department because Jacob Markstrom isn't getting any younger. Jake Allen has been quite solid for them, but he's also on the older side of things, so we'll see. Could a player like a Nico Dawes be a future goaltender for them? I'm not quite sure, but I'm still thinking they'll be all right eventually and still make it work. Now we move to the Ottawa Senators, and thank goodness they're finally in the finished rebuilding tier. They might have been in this position in terms of what they wanted to be last year, but this year they're finally backing it up with playoff results so far. They're in a playoff spot and pretty handedly. They still have a little bit of ways to go, but they still have a good shot at it, which is great to see. And for Ottawa, of how much we've seen that youth improving year after year, it's great to finally see that improvement. Of course, with the additions in the goaltending department as well, that's really helped them. But just the depth throughout that roster and how much they've been just a clutch team throughout this year, it's great to see. And it's great to finally see them getting past that rebuilding tier. Now, moving on to St. Louis, this is another team kind of like Calgary that is kind of in a world of its own. And you know what? We're making just a tier for itself here because I think St. Louis is such a unique case where they have rebuilt so perfectly on the fly, especially with the acquisitions of players like Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg in the offer sheets. They've been really showing the creativity in adding younger pieces, and I think that is something that more teams should be replicating. St. Louis never went in a rebuild. They were always still trying to compete, but it seems like they found creative ways to get back in the race and still compete with the older core they have. And I think that's especially important considering the pretty underrated prospect pool they have. Of course, you've seen the addition now of Dvorsky into the NHL, but you have so many other players like, of course, Snuggerud onto that forward group who will be coming in soon, and a lot of guys to get excited for. I think for St. Louis as well, the depth. They haven't really traded many picks over the years. They haven't really gone for it in any single season, so that's really allowed the prospect pool to acclimate throughout these last few seasons. I think for the Blues, they're in a pretty unique position going forward where even though they have an older core, the young core is going to really supplement some of that offense, and especially in the cases of Dvorsky and Snuggerud, that power play is going to be really interesting coming up, on top of Zach Bolduc as well, who's done really good in that department as well. Now on to the Seattle Kraken, and they're a team also that I really don't understand the direction they're trying to head in, because it seems like they've been also in a rebuilding position, but also still trying to compete, but not really getting the most out of their older players. I think they're still going to go in the already rebuilding tier. They're kind of in the Anaheim situation where they're still competence, they're okay, but they haven't been able to make that huge push. They had that second round berth, but after that, it's kind of been mediocre in every other season. They have some really good pieces coming up on the younger side, like Matty Beniers, Shane Wright, and a lot of the depth coming up on the defense, but I think for them, they still could use another top-tier defenseman. They could still use some more star power that right now they're seriously lacking. But I would say out of all these already rebuilding tier teams, they're probably the closest next year to making the playoffs, especially if Joey Daccord continues to be one of the more underrated goaltenders as he is now. Now on to the Detroit Red Wings, and they're a team that I think in terms of their identity, they practically finished rebuilding, but I gotta be honest, I mean, in terms of what they're actually looking like right now, I still think they could use a little bit more juice. Now, they still have a Fitbit coming up, and of course, some of the younger players on the defense, especially like Edmondson, are still finding their way, but you'll have players like Axel Cini and Palika coming up. You'll have Nate Danielson, who I think will be solid for them. Bolchinikov will bring some good offense, and of course, the goaltending side of things with Augustine and Kosa, I think will be a serious upgrade over the situation they have now. But Detroit is in a unique position where they want to be in the position Ottawa's in, where they're taking that big next step. They just haven't found a way to be consistent this year. It seems like they'll go on a run and then right afterwards lose 7 straight games and be right back in the same position. It's a shame because I think this year they had potential, but I think, again, the goaltending, the serious issues again on the defense have led Detroit to be in this spot, and it's sad because they were issues that should have been solved by now. If only you kept Jake Wallman. Just saying. Now on to my Dallas Stars, and they're a team that has pretty solidified themselves into the contenders now and in the future. I mean, if you're looking for a blueprint for teams that are keeping that older core while supplementing them with younger talent, Dallas is a great example of that. Really, they had maybe a year and a half of bad seasons and turned that into, of course, the legendary 2017 draft. You have so many younger names with Hintz, with Robertson, and not on the younger side of things, with Bichelle and Wyatt Johnston and Maverick Bourque. It's a shame Logan Stankoven had to get dealt, but it was a necessary decision, and especially in Ranson's case, he's been really underrated, getting his feet going in these last couple of games, which is great to see. For the Stars, they're an immediate contender with how good they've been all around, with how much depth there is as well on that roster. They have to be in this spot. Now on to the Edmonton Oilers, and they're going to be in the same exact tier there. I would say they're in a similar position to Colorado, where the only reason they're in this position is because of their unbelievable prime players being as good as they have been. Guys like McDavid, guys like Bouchard, guys like Draisaitl especially, who has been unbelievable this season. I would say for Colorado, though, that's really masking some of the youth issues, because especially for Edmonton, they had Holloway, you had Philip Broberg, 2 guys that were looking really interesting, especially at last year's playoffs that they let go, of course, in those offer sheets. And imagine how good, say, Edmonton could be. Imagine how better their future would look if they still had at least one of them. If they had a player like Holloway, I think he still could have broken out in a major way. He was looking really good at the end of last season, really improving in a lot of ways. Just the finishing wasn't quite there. And I think for Edmonton, that's going to be a serious issue coming up. Really, besides Matthew Savoy, maybe Bo Akey, there's not much in that prospect pool that really inspires me, that will really be solidified NHLers. And I think for Edmonton, that prospect pool could really come back to bite them, especially the depth issues already. They're in a unique position, but we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But I think they're still contenders now, but in a few years, they might have to reevaluate things with the way they're trending. Now onto the Tampa Bay Lightning, and I would say they're probably in the lowest section in the contenders now in the future, because I do think maybe in a couple of years' time, Tampa Bay might have to do some heavy digging here, but let's be honest, they're another team like St. Louis has gotten really creative with the older core they have, and the superstars they still have like Brayden Point, Kucherov, Vasilevsky have been still exceptional, and they've made the right decisions. Letting go of players like Steven Stamkos might have been gut-wrenching, but it was the right decision at the time looking back on it, and you have players like, as well like Victor Hedman, who have been excellent this year, but I think they've done a pretty pretty decent job bringing in some good youth. Connor Geeky's had some good moments here and there. You have players as well in the defense like JJ Moser who have been terrific for them. And Tampa Bay's just made right moves all along the way. And even though I still think some of that core, especially once players like Hedman get even older, might create some issues, I think for Tampa still, they've really solidified themselves in this spot and still deserve our respect. Now onto the Utah Hockey Club, and this is a weird one as well to talk about because I think they've been a team that's been rebuilding, especially with Arizona when you count them for a pretty long time now. But they're another team that's been, I think, jumping back into the standings this year, being more of a competent team, and especially next year, hopefully if they're a little bit more healthy, they'll be in a better position. I would say for them, they're just in the finished rebuilding tier, mostly because a lot of that core, I think, is already in place with players like Clayton Keller, Logan Cooley, Nick Schmaltz, and then you have so many players coming up as well, like TJ Ginla, Dmitry Simashev, and so much to look forward to there. And in this draft, I think they could also add to that defense as well. It'll be interesting to see how that goaltending goes in the future. We'll see if a player like a Michael Robel is able to actually live up to the standards that he's set for himself. But I think for Utah, they're in a good position going forward with one of the better young cores in the league, and it's up to them to really work on that and prove themselves next year. Now, this one might get a little bit of controversy, but I think it needs to be said. I think for Vancouver, they're in the need a rebuild soon tier. This is one that I kind of go back and forth on because they're, like we talked about with teams like Edmonton as well, they're in a similar position where their core players are still extremely young. Guys like Quinn Hughes, guys like Elias Pettersson. But I think that's kind of a reason why I want them to kind of go in a rebuilding direction, because I think for this Vancouver team, I don't think they're going really anywhere fast. The depth is a serious issue, and besides players like Quinn Hughes, there's really not much on that roster that I think is going to get extreme results in the future. They have some good prospects coming up. Of course, Elias Pettersson on defense, Tom Willander, Jonathan Lekaramaki, some really good pieces, but I don't think there's anybody that really is going to be true top-tier players like Elias Pettersson or Quinn Hughes. They don't have to be, but I think for Vancouver, they're in a position where they really need to get a lot more young. They need to get a lot more depth, especially on that roster in the future. And even though I like a lot of the pieces there, I have trouble seeing where they're really going to make serious improvements. Unless they get extremely creative with an offer sheet this year, I think they're a team that I'd like to see, especially this season, going in a full-scale pick direction, trying to get as many prospects in that pool as possible, because I think for Vancouver, especially with how this team is looking right now, I don't think they have much of a future if they continue to trend the way they have. Now on to the Florida Panthers, and they're another team as well that goes straight in the contenders now and in the future tier. I think they did a really good job, and honestly have a little bit of an underrated prospect pool. You have a player like Mackie Simaskevich, who has graduated this year, but he's been a really under-the-radar rookie this season. But you also got players like Jack Devine as well coming up, Tyler Muslik as well on the goaltending side. You have some pretty good options there. Nothing that's overwhelmingly good, but I think Jack Devine especially is somebody who's been a terrific player for Denver, who could be pretty good in the future. And what do I have to say about the team now? They're obviously still a true contender, have done so well for themselves, and they're not extremely old. Everybody's pretty much in the prime of their careers, maybe besides Sergei Bobrovsky, who's right now on the end of things, but he's somebody that'll still be competent for the now, and that's exactly what they need. The defense is still looking great, especially with the options they've added. You look at the forward group, and there's still so many weapons there. Especially right now, they'll be pretty fine, and in the future, especially with the ages of everybody, they're not going to be in a bad position anytime soon. Now on to the New York Islanders next up, and they're the latest team to be straight in the full rebuild now tier. Now, I think they've done a little bit going in that direction, but not a full-scale one. But honestly, I think for this Islanders team, they're in desperate need of one. You can build around a Barzal and a Dobson, I guess, but the rest of the roster just hasn't really done much else there. And I like a player like Anders Lee, but how much is he going to be able to produce like he has this season in the future? I just think for them, they're in a unique position where they can rebuild on the fly, but I think they need to start this now. They need to really get it going. Now, the Brock Nelson trade has done that, but I think they could do a lot more this offseason to really gut that roster and trim out the fat. Especially with players like Sorokin, who are still in the prime of their careers. That's an excellent goaltender still built around, even though there is some issues there. So I think for the Islanders, they have some good young pieces, especially coming up as well in the prospect pool. Guys like Cal Ritchie now, Cole Iserman, Quinn Finley, Isaiah George. There's some good names to work around. But I think for the Islanders, they could really use a boost over these next couple of years. And there's an opportunity here to build one of the more underrated young cores in the league. I think for them, though, the time is now, and especially with this draft, it could be a major focus if they want it to be. Now, another team that I think is going to go in the need one soon tier is actually the Minnesota Wild. Now, I don't think this is a team that necessarily needs more prospects because I think they have a pretty great prospect pool. They have a lot of guys who have graduated this year, like players like Marco Rossi officially over the last couple of years, who's been really good. Brock Faber, of course, has come up in a major way for them, but they still have a lot of ways to go in terms of guys graduating, like Liam Ogren, for example. Jesper Wallstedt still has a little bit of ways to go. So they have still some really good players like Danila Yurov as well, who have yet to sign, who could be pretty good forces for this team. So I think for Minnesota, there's still some good qualities there. But I just look at that roster and I look at what they have coming up, and a lot of the really impact players they have are on the older side of things. Really, besides the exceptions of Kaprizov, Rossi, and players like Gustafsson as well, they have a pretty older depth core. And I think for Minnesota, they're in a position where they don't have to rebuild for 5 years or anything. I don't think they have to go that full scale. But I think in the next couple of years, they could also, like a team like the Islanders, really boost up the core they have already. And Kaprizov, I think, is also still young enough where they can afford to have that happen and still be in the prime of his career by the time this mini retool is over. I don't think it's realistic for Minnesota to ever go in that type of direction. I think they're still going to want to contend as much as possible every single year of Kaprizov, but I think they're a team that could really use even more reinforcements in the future, especially on the forward group, where I think the depth will become a serious issue once some of those players like Mats Zuccarello end up graduating. We'll see what happens, but I think for Minnesota, they're a team that I would like to see go in an even younger direction and really maximize that strength going forward. Now, next up, I have the LA Kings, and they're in a position I could say similarly as well to St. Louis, where they have a couple of younger pieces, of course, on that roster that were doing great things. But I think for LA, they're kind of in the already or finished rebuilding tier, where I think they're a team that's obviously solidified themselves as a contender for the playoffs pretty much every single year. But they're not one that I regularly see as like true contenders. This year maybe is a little bit different. Maybe they'd be just off the end of the contenders now in the future tier. But I think their prospect pool is a little bit lacking, and especially with the rebuild they went on just a few years ago, a lot of the prospects they drafted in high positions haven't really worked out. You have some exceptions like Quinton Byfield really getting going, but you have a lot of disappointments on that team that just haven't been able to really maximize their potential, especially with Anze Kopitar and Drew Doughty. They still have some great moments here and there, but they're getting older and aren't going to be there forever. I think for the LA Kings team, they're going to really lack some star power once those players are gone. I think they'll be okay for the future, but I think they're a team that maybe needs to go in a slight retooling direction at some point. Not now, I would say, but it's something to think about. We'll see what ends up happening, but if they are to give actual playing time to players like Brandt Clark especially, I think they can negate that. It's up to them, though, if they really want to prioritize the future, because I think there's an opportunity to. Now we go on to the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I think they're going to be squarely inside the contenders now and in the future tier. Now, if you actually debate about the Stanley Cup contender position, that could be something to be debated, but I think in terms of contenders for the next little bit, they're still going to be in that position. Of course, with the young core of Matthews, Marner, Nylander, they still have a lot to work with there. I think for Toronto, the big thing, though, will be the youth coming up, because really there's been a few exceptions here and there, players like Matthew Nice who have come up and been impact players for them, but a lot of that prospect pool hasn't been as nourished as you'd want it to be. And even though you have a couple of players who I think will be NHLers eventually, like Easton Cowan and Ben Danford, there's not a lot of else out there that I think will really be able to supplant the depth they have there already. I think that could prove to be a little bit of an issue in the future, but for now, I think they're safe. Now we go to the Winnipeg Jets, and they're another team that I will put squarely in the contenders now in the future. Obviously now they're a contender for sure, but I think they did a pretty good job as well rebuilding that prospect pool on the fly. I mean, you have a few players there that I love, like Brad Lambert, for example. Nikita Chibrikov, I think, is going to be pretty solid for them. Some really young players that I think will do well for them, and especially with how much they've been able to bring along players like Dylan Sandberg as well. When the right prospects come in that will prove themselves, Winnipeg has shown to develop them well, and especially with the core they have already, they're not young, I think, by any means, but they still are in the prime of their careers. Players like Schaefer, players like Connor, Ehlers, especially Connor Hellebuck, they're not old whatsoever. They're not in their 35-year-old age. I think for Winnipeg, they're in a position to compete a lot for the next few years. These next 5 years, I think, are going to be critical, but they also have a pretty decent prospect pool who I think will make it okay once those core players get a little bit older. Now we go on to the Vegas Golden Knights, and I think they're a team that probably is in the need one soon tier. Now, soon depends on the person. I think for Vegas, they're a team that will be able to survive, especially over the next 2-3 years, I think. But after that, I think is when things are going to get a little bit interesting. Of course, you're still going to have the unbelievable play of Jack Eichel, but you're going to have a lot of players like Mark Stone, Alex Pietrangelo, who aren't going to be in their prime of their careers anymore. And I think for Vegas, they'll still survive over the next couple of seasons, but that prospect pool is looking bleak. Now, of course, with how much they trade their draft picks, they could go in any single direction there. But I think as of right now, they really need to win some Stanley Cups in the future, because afterwards, it could be rough. And especially with how badly they develop the players they already have that they draft. I mean, Pavel Dorofeyev is maybe the only player that Vegas has drafted who has actually turned into a competent NHLer for them. The rest, it's not looking too great. Now we go into the New York Rangers, and this is going to be another team that goes straight up inside the full rebuild now tier. This is, to me, a pretty slam dunk in my opinion, because you still have some players there that I think will be good by the time a full-scale rebuild is over. Players like Shesterkin, Alexis Lafreniere, and on the defensive side, you have some interesting options still in Adam Fox, but I just don't think it's good enough to warrant keeping this core together, because pretty consistently they've shown to not be able to get it done. And Artemi Panarin is not getting any younger. Same thing goes with players like Mika Zibanejad. They tried, of course, to bring in JT Miller, revamp that defense, but it just has not worked whatsoever. There's been some good moments here and there, but it has not proven to really result in consistent streaks, consistent winning, consistent success. I think the writing is on the wall for this Rangers team that rebuild they went on was a complete disaster. So few of those players actually turned out to be impact players for them, besides guys like Shesterkin and players that were practically given to them like Adam Fox. I think for New York, they really need to prioritize development. They need to prioritize actually giving these players the proper standard of training and consistency, because what they're doing right now ain't working. Now, going on to the Philadelphia Flyers, they're a team that also is in the already rebuilding tier. I would say they're further along than teams like Chicago, for example, but I think they're a team that is kind of in a weird position now. With the firing of John Tortorella, they have a lot of questions to answer about their future. I think they have a decent core coming up. I like players like Jet Luchenko. Of course, Matvei Michkov is going to be absolutely terrific. But I still think there are a few holes coming up on potentially the goaltending side, even though Björn Söderlund has shown some good things. I still think that defense could use some big revamping in the future. I think for Philly, they're not quite done or nearly close to it of what I'd like to see that roster really turned over, but they still have some quality pieces that will turn into solid players in the future. Though I think this next coach especially could be extremely important. If they were to get somebody that I love, like a David Carl, for example, I think Philly could look a lot better in the future, but I think coaching is really going to take this roster and turn it into a different direction if they make the right decision. Next up, we go on to the next Pennsylvania team in the Pittsburgh Penguins, and they're in a much different position, I would say, to the Philadelphia Flyers, where the success has been there consistently. Now they're reaping the issues of that type of situation. But I think we've seen Pittsburgh kind of come out and kind of be accepting of that, saying to players like Crosby that, hey, we're just going to go for the best players possible. It might take some pain in the future. It might take some rebuilding, but it's what's necessary, and that's great to see. Pittsburgh has long needed to finally go in a more young, youthful direction. They can definitely get a lot more creative to do that and don't have to go in this full-scale rebuild. But I think for Pittsburgh, they're still going to go in the full rebuild now tier. They're in a situation where I think they need to strip it down to the studs. Not completely. You still, of course, keep the core there. And if you want to keep a player like Rickard Rakell because of how consistent he's been this year, I understand why. But the rest of the roster, I think, can be turned over. It just hasn't proven to be good enough. I think for Pittsburgh, especially these next couple of drafts, if they could land a McKenna or a Dupont, that changes that franchise around completely, and I think for Pittsburgh, it's a worthwhile endeavor. Now, going on to the last couple of teams here, we have the Washington Capitals, which I think have proven themselves to be in the contenders now and in the future tier. I gotta give credit to Washington in pretty much every situation I can. I mean, they're a team that has done pretty much the banner job, just like Dallas has, of rebuilding on the fly. You still have some of those older players like John Carlson and Alexander Ovechkin, for example, but they've done such a good job with their pro scouting, getting players like Logan Thompson as well on the goaltending side, Jacob Chychrun onto the defense, Matt Roy, but also the youth development that they've had. Martin Baravari on that defense has been huge for them. The forwards that they've had bringing up in players like Connor McMichael and Alexi Protas and how much they've changed that forward group completely. There's just been so many success stories, and they have a good prospect pool coming up as well. Players like Ryan Leonard, of course, as the big ones coming up, will have a lot to give. You, of course, have Alexi Protas' brother. You have a lot to look forward to there. And I think for Washington, they've really built themselves up into not just a scary team this year, but a scary team for years to come. But now we go on to the last team here in the Boston Bruins, and I save the best for last because they are a team going straight up at the very top of the full rebuild now tier. And to me, this should be pretty obvious as to why. The Bruins are in absolute no man's land. They have one of the worst prospect pools, if not the worst prospect pool in the entire league, and they're a team that just is going nowhere fast. They have some great young weapons still, like David Pastrnak and Charlie McAvoy, and even Jeremy Swayman, I would say. But so much of that roster, I think, needs to be changed while they still have the opportunity to do so. Those players like Pastrnak, McAvoy, they're still pretty young now, but they won't be in 8 years. And if Boston still continues to force this contending mode on this team, it's just not going to work. I think they went in a good direction this last trade deadline, even though the Marchand return was a little bit disappointing. The rest of it, I thought, was pretty good for them. They need to go into full-scale rebuild, prioritize these next couple of drafts, especially 2026, go full tank mode next year, because I don't think for the Bruins there's really any other way to stay competitive, especially with how much they've stripped it down to the studs already. But you've gotten some good development stories in players like Lowride this year. Morgan Geekie has looked good, so it's not completely barren. You just have to build up that prospect pool again, and they have the opportunity to do so. But right now, it's looking really bad. They need to replenish that fast. But I want to know in the comments down below what you guys agree, what you guys disagree with, and where would you put your favorite team as well in the tier list? Do they need to rebuild? Do they need to get out of it? Let me know your thoughts down below. And of course, if all the hockey fans you guys know online, click on the like button and click on the subscribe button as well for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year. And if you want some more videos, click on this card for all of my hockey rankings content right in one playlist. A lot of stuff there for you to binge. And I'll see you guys in the next one. I hope you have a fantastic hockey day and drink some water for me, of course. Goodbye.